level of Ispoidus. Say hello to Gashmius. Let it know you're gonna bring Achdus and introduce it to your Ruchnius. The first level of Ispoidus. Say hello to Gashmius. Let it know you're gonna bring Achdus and introduce it to your Ruchnius. Oh Hashem, I wanna talk to you. I wanna get close to you. Oh Hashem, I wanna talk to you. I wanna get close to you. Even if you think that you're really far, but just remember who you really are. You are a piece of Hashem, and He wants you to talk to Him. If you think that you're really far, just remember who you really are. You are a piece of Hashem, and He wants you to talk to Him. Oh Hashem, I just want to talk to you. I want to get close to you. Oh Hashem, I want to talk to you. I want to get close to you. Every now and then speak to Him in your own words. Learn this from the beautiful birds. Watch them tweet, get out of your seat, and go to the woods and talk to the Lord. Every now and then speak to Him in your own words.
Hello, my holy brothers and sisters. How are you? It's great to be with you. Let's light up the darkness. Ooh, didn't light. Okay. Let's see who's with us today. We've got Yehudit Sobel from Florence, South Carolina. Stephen Giger from Dover, New Hampshire. James Roth in the house from Indianapolis. Nancy Brundemel Wright from Southern Pines, North Carolina. Melissa Teljurin says, good evening from Great Neck, New York. Christo Cheney with us from Lubbock. He looks forward to this every day. Brandon Christian Sullivan, shalom from Knoxville. Always a joy to study Torah with the AT family. Thank you, Brandon. Michael Reichler says, shalom from Arizona. Michael and I grew up together in New City, New York. Irdansia Tanjung says, shalom from Indonesia. Great to see you. Sandra Golem from Parker, Colorado. Francis Vanya Borges Vane says, shalom. Adonai Boker Tov from Japan. Japan in the house. How awesome. Bill Eldridge with us from Pollard, Arkansas. Rochelle Rosen from North Dakota. There's at least one Jew here today. I think you mean North Dakota. Lucy Ram Johnson says, shalom from Minnesota. Thanks for the song. That was Moshe Storch doing his song, Oh Hashem, recently debuted on our page. I just love that song. I could listen to it over and over again. Beck Cicada from South Carolina, USA. Malka Silver says, Shabbat Shalom from Australia. Bryna Bloomfield, hi, somewhere between Muncie, New York and Providence, Rhode Island. Guy Thomas Kennedy from Dayton. Robin Stewart from Ohio. Barbara Ravitz Melanik from Manchester, New Jersey. Randy Lieberman says, Herman says shalom from Florida. Sue Strauss in the house from Chicago. Sarah McKay from Apple Valley. Donna Smith from Bahama, North Carolina. Man, everyone's getting here early. It's great. Andrea Reich from Dallas. Patrice Carter from St. George, Utah. Alice Gross is back and with us from Baltimore. And here we go. Lynn is with us from Texas. Debbie Schweigart from Barnegat, New Jersey. And Marjorie Holler from Georgia. Great to be with you, my pals. All right. Where are we? By the way, this is my favorite of the new shirts from the AT store. If you get what this is all about, then you gotta have this shirt. Nina will put the link in the comments. Okay, we are on Erev Daf Dalet. That's page 4 of, Eruvin, tractate Eruvin, the 3rd volume of the Talmud. We are still discussing the first Mishna of chapter 1. As we wound up yesterday, we saw that Rava said in the name of Rav Nachman that all the cubits which the sages use in their measures are large cubits, right? So yes, we're generally talking about how we correct an alleyway, which, private courtyards open up into it. The alley leads the people who leave their courtyards out into the main thoroughfare. Certainly the main thoroughfare, that's the public domain. The private courtyards are definitely the private domain. So on Shabbos, you can't carry, unless there's an Erev, you can't carry from the private domain out of your courtyard, your private courtyard. So the sages established that we could turn that alleyway that joins the courtyards into an Erev where people could carry by putting a crossbeam over the opening. And we saw that crossbeam had to be no more than 20 cubits off the ground. And then we started to see toward the end of yesterday's session that the cubits were just not standardized. And so depending on who was talking and what they were talking about, the cubit might be a large cubit or a small cubit. A large cubit was 6 handbreadths long, and a small cubit was 5 handbreadths long. So Rava said in the name of Rav Nachman that all cubits that are involved in the measurements of the sages are large cubits. So the 6 handbreadths, or 6 tefachim. A tefach is a handbreadth, so 6 tefachim, 6 handbreadths constitute the large cubit. And Rav, in the name of Rav Nachman, is saying that whenever the sages are talking about a cubit in terms of measurements, they mean it's a 6 handbreadth cubit. But depending on what area of the law they're talking about, the handbreadths, those 6 handbreadths, might be the laughing handbreadth or the sad handbreadth. Meaning the laughing handbreadth, where the fingers are a little bit apart, the way that somebody's lips are open when they're laughing, or the fingers are closed together like a person who's sad, his lips are closed, and so the sad handbreadth is a little bit smaller than the laughing handbreadth. And in the area of kilayim, meaning that we don't plant different kinds of plants in the same field, they need to be separated, right? We don't plant diverse kinds in the same plot, especially we don't plant, like say, vegetables or wheat in a vineyard, right? We're going to keep different things that we're growing separate. Judaism is so much, Torah is so much about distinctions, creating distinctions. So we need to keep things apart, and there's going to be minimum measures for the distance between them so that they are apart. And in that case, we're going to use, according to Rav in the name of Rav Nachman, we're going to use the laughing handbreadth. It's going to be a cubit. It's a certain number of cubits that these plants have to be planted apart, and it's always going to be the large cubit, 6 handbreadths, but with the extra breadth of the handbreadth, with the fingers are a little bit apart when we're talking about diverse kinds. But when we're talking about the measurements of a sukkah, that's going to be the sad handbreadth. It's a little bit smaller, a little bit more compressed. Okay, now that's what Rav Nachman said. Not everybody agrees with him. So it is not true that all of the measurements of the sages are always the 6 cubit handbreadth, but it's gonna be generally true, as we'll see. The question that we had at the end of yesterday is, why go through all this bother and all this craziness, all this headache? Why didn't they just standardize the measurements? Just get 1 cubit that we all can agree on, make a cubit stick, and that's it. That's the stick. And the answer is, who are the sages? The sages who are trying to standardize everything, or not really standardize, but get the law set and formalized so that everyone in the Jewish world knows what laws to follow. Well, they're working that out in the very late Second Temple period, but primarily after the Second Temple has been destroyed and for the next few hundred years. The Mishna is going to close in the year 200. The temple destroyed in about the year 70. The Mishna set down by the year 200 of the Common Era, and the Talmud, meaning the Gemara, the commentary on the Mishnah, that's going to get set down by about the year 500, more or less. So during these hundreds of years, over generations, they're working out exactly what the law is. But they're not the president and vice president. They're not the kings of the country. They're not in charge. They are the religious authority, so they are telling people how they can fulfill their biblical obligations, and they're creating rabbinic prohibitions so that people are protected and they don't come to transgress biblical prohibitions. That's their authority. But they can't say, especially say the Jewish community in Babylonia, who's a tiny minority of the population of Babylonia, that, well, we're going to declare what the standard measures are. People had standard measures, right? Not even all the Jews were religious. Then, like now, there were many Jews who turned their back on Judaism. So they're really telling the religious Jewish population how to fulfill their obligations, but they're working in the context, right, of people who have their own measures for other things, primarily in commerce and in construction, but in an area of the world that is largely, or, you know, and this is the way most of the world was throughout history, even when you have large empires, still people are going to have different measures locally. So the sages are doing the best that they can, defining things and telling people what their obligations are, but they're working in a very traditional context with measures that have come down through the generations within the Jewish world, and understanding how that's going to interact with the greater world around them. They're primarily concerned, however, with one's religious obligations. And so they're going to get measures and define measures based on their tradition and, particularly whenever possible, scriptural sources. But it wasn't always possible to get a scriptural source. So, okay. Rab Chia bar Ashi said in the name of Rav that measures having to do with mitzvahs in the Torah, right? So when you have a Torah obligation to do something, and there's going to be a minimum or a maximum measure for it, like what we've been talking about, as well as the laws of the interpositions of immersion in a mikveh, meaning that when somebody has to immerse in a mikveh, in a ritual bath, because they're tameh, they're ritually impure, and they're going to immerse and purify themselves and then become ritually pure. And so there's going to be a whole bunch of laws of the mikveh. Today, mikveh is only used by married women who, after their menses, go to the mikveh, immerse, and then that night they're permitted again, that she and her husband are permitted to each other. And a Jewish convert, somebody who converts to Judaism, male or female, will immerse in the mikveh once, and that to finish the process of converting to Judaism. But in old times, when the temple stood, the mikveh was used much more often and for many more reasons, primarily because if you were in a state of tumah, if you were impure, you couldn't walk into the temple courtyard to bring an offering. Okay, so there are many laws about the mikveh. One of them is a person has to immerse themselves completely in the mikveh if there's something on their skin, if they're wearing a ring, for example. If I was wearing my ring and I immersed in the mikveh, my immersion would not be valid, would not be a kosher immersion, because there's this interposition between the waters of the mikveh and my hand. I would have to remove my ring before I get in there. That's an easy case. There are other cases that are more nuanced and difficult to answer, but the laws of interpositions, according to Rab Chia in the name bar Ashi in the name of Rav, the laws about interpositions, as well as the measures of mitzvahs, as well as the laws of partitions, meaning mechitzos, partitions, and we've been talking a lot about those, the partitions that delineate a private domain from the public domain, etc. The laws of partitions, all these areas of the law were given to Moses at Sinai, meaning they're not in the written Torah, but the core rulings of these areas of the law, the measurements of mitzvahs, the interpositions that invalidate a mikveh, an immersion in a mikveh, and the measures of partitions were all given to Moses as part of the oral law at Sinai. So this is a core belief, a core tenet of Judaism, that Moses received the written Torah at Mount Sinai and the oral Torah. And when we say the Torah, generally, we mean both. That the written Torah and the oral Torah, they were both given at Mount Sinai. The written Torah has never changed since it was given at Mount Sinai. The oral Torah was given in such a way that a bunch of core teachings were given at that time, along with the process by which it could grow, so that the sages would know how to apply the written laws and the original oral laws in a world that would keep changing. Because the world keeps changing, new questions will come up, and the sages over the generations can figure out how to apply the written law in those new situations. So these particular laws, the measurements of certain mitzvahs, the laws of the interpositions, and the measurements of the partitions, the initial teachings were given to Moses at Mount Sinai. So teachings like that are called halachas, laws, or the ways of the law, LeMoshe miSinai, to Moses. LeMoshe means to Moses, miSinai, from Sinai. In other words, God told Moses these laws, and they were passed down through the generations through the oral tradition. Okay, so Rav Hanan says, well, you just said that the measurements that pertain to the mitzvahs, the measurements that we need in order to fulfill the commandments in the Torah, were given to Moses at Sinai. What are you talking about? They're in the Torah. They weren't part of the oral teaching. They were part of the written teaching. How could he say that? A lot of these laws, we know these numbers are not in the Torah. They had to come from somewhere else. Either they were derived over time through biblical exegesis, or it was given to Moses and passed down through the generations. How could you say that they're in the written Torah? So Rav Hanan explains. We have a verse detailing the seven species that characterize the beauty and the fruitfulness of the land of Israel. What is Israel? It is a land of wheat and barley, vines and figs, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey. And these seven products of the land of Israel, natural products of the land of Israel, are not just in the Torah in order for us to describe the land of Israel and its beauty and fruitfulness, and that this is how we praise the land of Israel by naming these seven products of the land, but rather this verse also is the source for numerical measurements that apply to the commandments. What is he saying? How can Rav Hanan say that? What does he mean? Well, let's start with wheat. How is wheat, when we say that it is a land of wheat and barley, how is wheat a measurement? Answer, in a very specific situation, when one enters a house that has tzara'as. Okay, so tzara'as, usually translated as leprosy, it's a terrible translation. Tzara'as was a skin condition that only existed in the ancient world, does not exist anymore. And it was a physical manifestation of a spiritual malaise, a spiritual sickness, as it were, a spiritual illness that would cause you to break out on your skin. Now, you can say that in modern times, well, definitely the psychological conditions are related to things like eczema, which are stress-related for sure. But this is a specific thing that if you were engaging in certain kinds of spiritual transgression over time, eventually your skin would break out in this particular thing called tzara'as, which would require an elaborate purification ritual. Not only could people's skin break out with tzara'as, but so could their homes, the walls of their homes. You would get, it's not mold, like you would get some kind of a weird discoloration in the walls of your home. Often tzara'as was associated with speaking lashon hara, speaking with an evil tongue, embarrassing other people, gossiping about other people, slandering other people. that kind of talk is very harmful. And if a lot of that was going on in a house, it could lead to tzara'as. Sometimes it wasn't because they were doing that kind of thing in the house. Sometimes it was just a gift from God because they would eventually have to tear down the walls, and then sometimes they would find treasure in those walls. We have a teaching like that from Rashi. Anyway, what we're talking about right now is that a house has this outbreak in its walls. So any person who enters a house that has tzara'as will become tameh. They will become ritually impure, and they're going to have to go through their own purification process just because they entered into that house. Now, because we have a law that says he will become impure and he shall have to wash his clothes, the sages actually learned out that a person becomes impure and their clothes that the person is wearing become impure, but it turns out that they become impure at a different rate. A person becomes impure as soon as he enters the house. His clothes, the clothes he's wearing, will only become impure if he lingers in the house for a certain amount of time. How long is that amount of time? Enough time to eat half a loaf of wheat bread, not barley bread, half a loaf of wheat bread with some relish. That is a unit of time. How long is that? We have more precise measurements these days. But, maybe our precision, for all the importance of having precise measurements of time, distance, area, volume, etc., maybe we lose something when we don't have these kinds of colorful measurements that really lead you to think. How long does it take for your clothes to become impure when you enter a house that has tzara'as? If you linger in that house long enough to eat half a loaf of bread with relish. I mean, just off the top of my head, if you just sit down and eat in such a house and not notice that those, that the walls have tzara'as, if that house is available for you to enter, that house should have been like locked up. The owners needed to close up that house while that house is going through its own purification process. A lot had to go wrong for a person to go in there and sit and have a meal. He should definitely be thinking very carefully about what went wrong when he gets himself into that situation. Anyway, that's where we see that wheat actually translates into a measurement, in this case, a measurement of time. What about barley? Barley is also used as the basis of a measurement, in this case, volume. A grain of barley is very small, and that's all the amount we need of a human corpse in order to transmit the very strong ritual impurity, the very strong tuma of a corpse if you touch it or carry it. So even if the body was buried long ago, but then it was in a field, and then the field got plowed up, and some bones were found of this human body, even a piece as small as a barley corn, a grain of barley, will transmit tuma, will transmit that ritual impurity, and whoever touches it or carries it will have to go through the immersion and purification process. What about the vine, right? In other words, grapevines, the vines that lead to wine. How is this a measurement? What measurement is implied by that? So we have the law of the Nazirite, in Hebrew, the Nazir. The Nazir is somebody who takes a vow for a certain amount of time to not drink, eat, or benefit from the fruit of the vine. So if he takes that vow, he's obligated. He cannot drink wine. If he does, it's a sin. Nobody forced him to take that vow, to undertake that vow. He made that choice. The sages generally look down on taking vows. The Nazir knew that, he was undertaking something that was going to be difficult for him. If he then breaks his own vow, he's going to be punished for that. He could actually be flogged. He would receive lashes. But only if he drinks a minimum amount. How much is the minimum amount? A quarter lug of wine, also called a revi'is, or a revis, the simple pronunciation of revis. But it's a certain amount of wine. If he drinks less than that, he didn't do anything. If he drinks more than that, he's going to be flogged. The pomegranate. What is the measure related to a pomegranate? We saw this during Tractate Shabbos, that a wooden vessel can be made impure. It can be rendered tameh But if there are holes in it that are as large as pomegranates, well, you can't call that a vessel anymore. It won't hold liquid or even solids, right? Everything will fall through those holes. So it is no longer a vessel, and therefore it cannot contract ritual impurity. It is considered pure. It is tahor. It just is pure because it cannot become impure if it has holes the size of pomegranates in it. What about the olive? The olive is the basis of so many different measurements having to do with the mitzvahs that the sages say that, well, the olive is what most of the mitzvahs minimum measures are based on. So the olive bulk, right, the volume that about the size of an olive is probably the most important measure in the Talmud. It comes up all the time. Honey. What about honey? Now, when honey is mentioned in the Bible or talked about by the sages, they generally do not mean the honey of bees. They mean the honey that comes from dates. So a date bulk is larger than an olive bulk. For what is that a measure? If on Yom Kippur you eat some food, then you have violated the fast of Yom Kippur. If you eat less than the bulk of a date, from a date palm, so then you didn't really do anything. If you eat more than the volume of a date, you violated Shabbos. That's a serious sin. So now the Gemara, the sages challenge Rabbi Hanan, who said, well, these measures are explicit in the Torah. And says, what do you mean explicit? Okay, we derive measures from these 7 fruits or these 7 products of the land of Israel, but you can't say that these measurements are explicit in the Torah. There's a lot of interpretation going on here to turn wheat and barley and pomegranates and olives and figs, and dates into an actual unit of measurement. And so we understand better that what it was that God said to Moses, you can use these objects for measurements. And over time, the sages defined exactly how that works. And so it's based in scripture, but it wasn't explicit. God had to tell Moses that you can derive measures from these foods. Then we come to the interposition. So this was the second category of laws that we just heard was transmitted to Moses orally at Mount Sinai. So if one immerses in a mikveh and there's an interposition between their skin and the water, it would invalidate the immersion in the mikveh. So then the Gemara challenges and says, well, what are you talking about? We have immersion in the Torah, and the verse in the Torah says that you will immerse in the water, not just in water. So that tells us that a mikveh is a specific quantity of water with certain obligations in creating the mikveh. It's got to be some kind of flowing water. It can't be captured water. It can't be in a vessel. There's a lot of laws, and so it has to be a mikveh and not just any water. And the verse says that he will immerse all his flesh when he immerses. And from all his flesh, the sages will learn out that it has to be large enough to get your whole body inside it. What is large enough? Basically something that is 3 cubits long and a cubit high and a cubit deep. Right, so kind of like a bathtub, but enough to get your whole body inside of it. How much volume is that? The sages call that 40 se'ah. 40 se'ah. It's just a specific volume in the Talmud. So that is implied in the Torah. I mean, that's written in the Torah. It's pretty explicit, so we can derive laws from what's explicitly in the Torah. What was it that God told Moses at Mount Sinai? Answer, this is so specific, it's crazy. The sages say, well, we know that if a hair on someone's head is tied in a knot, a single hair, right? If you take a single hair and you make a knot in that hair, the water is not going to be able to reach inside the knot and to make that immersion valid. If 3 hairs or more are tied in a knot, that knot cannot be very tight. And so the water can penetrate into the middle of the knot and the immersion will be valid. The question is, what about 2 hairs? Are 2 hairs, if you take 2 hairs and tie a knot with them, Is that not going to be so tight that water doesn't penetrate it? The sages didn't know the answer. For that ruling, we have to go to Moshe at Sinai. Right? That law was given to Moses at Sinai. I guess 2 hairs do invalidate. But of course, there's a lot more laws that go with this in terms of the 1 hair. If it's just literally 1 hair tied in a knot, that will not invalidate. You need a bunch of single hairs tied in knots. As I was reading about this, it occurred to me, I wonder if dreadlocks would invalidate an immersion in the mikveh, right? Because when somebody has dreadlocks, they wash their hair, but they don't comb it out. And over time, clumps of the hair get, natty and knotted and so knotted together that they can't be combed out, right? Dreadlocks are dreadlocks. You know what dreadlocks look like. So would that invalidate immersion in a mikveh? Turns out I'm not the first person to ask this question. Sometimes, women with dreadlocks get married. They want to live a religious lifestyle. They want to do the mikveh once a month. What about their dreadlocks? Or somebody who has dreadlocks converts to Judaism. What about his or her immersion? Will it be valid? So, not surprisingly, there are various opinions on this. They disagree with each other. But there are multiple opinions that say the dreadlocks will not invalidate the mikveh. It is a valid immersion in a mikveh, even if a person has dreadlocks. And what's so interesting about this is that here in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and he was writing in the 1800s, he actually addresses this topic. He doesn't call them dreadlocks, but he says, and this is Rabbi, I should have his name. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch is written by Rabbi Gansfried. So Rabbi Gansfried wrote, a woman whose hair is braided must undo her braids before immersing in the mikveh. Otherwise, the water can't get in there where the hair is in braids. But Kitzur discusses the halacha of a unique case where this is not possible. A woman who has braids of hair that are matted and adhered to each other, referred to in Yiddish as mortzep, M-O-H-R-T-Z-E-P. So I guess this is Yiddish for dreadlocks, right? So referred to in Yiddish as mortzep or morlocken, right? So that sounds like dreadlocks, morlocken. And in Polish and Russian as kultnis. And it is dangerous to cut them. They are not an interposition. Even if there are among these hairs some threads that cannot be removed, right? So imagine that sometimes dreadlocks are held together with beads and threads and other stuff that become permanent in the dreadlocks, and they cannot be removed if they are not visible on the outside. So if they're within the dreadlock, then they are not an interposition. Isn't that amazing? I would not have thought that somebody writing in the, very religious Jewish community in Europe in the 1800s was going to address the issue of dreadlocks in a mikveh. But there you go. Let's continue. So then we come to another area of the law that they said was given to Moses at Sinai, which is the law of partitions. So as we've seen, to define a private domain in terms of Shabbos, it has to have a partition around it that's at least 10 handbreadths high, 10 tefachim high. Where do we get that measure? How do we know that it's 10 tefachim, 10 handbreadths is what is the minimum measure for a fence around a private domain? We also saw this is the sides of a mound, and the top of the mound, as long as there's a minimum area, is going to be a private domain, or the bottom of a pit. So again, the mound has to be 10 handbreadths high, or the pit has to be 10 handbreadths deep. Same law as the fence around a private domain. How do we know that it's 10 handbreadths high? From this, we go to the measurements of the Ark of the Covenant, right? So you've seen it if you've seen the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. The Ark of the Covenant is where the children of Israel, as they traveled through the desert in the wilderness and eventually settled into the land of Israel, it's where we kept the tablets of the 10 Commandments, right? The second set of tablets that Moses carved and God inscribed, and the broken first set of tablets that God carved and inscribed, but Moses smashed when he saw the people dancing around the golden calf. They're kept in the ark. How large is the ark? The dimensions of the ark, the whole ark plus the ark cover is 10 handbreadths high. And why is that a partition? Because the Shekhinah, the divine presence, would rest over and within the Ark of the Covenant. And when it was resting there, it was considered to be resting there and not in the rest of the world. God is everywhere. We're in God. But the Shekhinah is a purposeful manifestation by God of God's presence. It's a representation created by God so that we can say, oh, okay, God's like attention, God's immediate presence is right there, and it would settle on the ark. And the sides, the height of the sides, including the cover, was 10 handbreadths. So now we get back to the cubit. Rabbi Yehuda says that the tabernacle, when they were constructing the tabernacle in the wilderness, and now it's a construction project, right? They need to have something standard so they can make all the beams the same size, the curtains the correct size. It's a big construction project. Now you really need a standard measure. The standard measure they used for that was a 6 tefach amma. In other words, a 6 handbreadth cubit, what we've been calling the large cubit. But the vessels in the tabernacle, so in other words, where they would receive the blood when an animal offering was slaughtered, where they would wash their hands, etc. The vessels in the temple that used by the priests, those were there. The small cubit was used in defining those vessels. Rabbi Meir disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda. He says that all the cubits were 6 handbreadth cubits, and what cubit is it? Which cubit is it? Is it the laughing handbreadths or is it the sad handbreadths? According to Rabbi Meir, it's a medium handbreadth, right? So he doesn't say anything more than that. It's medium. It's somehow maybe slightly apart, and he's saying we don't need a big one and a small one. It's just a regular handbreadth. And all of these measurements were based on the regular cubit with 6 regular handbreadths, is what Rabbi Meir says. But not everybody agrees with him, of course. But according to Rabbi Meir, there were other laws that were given to Moses at Sinai, including the fact that when we have a partition that doesn't reach the ground, we extend it as if it reached the ground. When we have a fence that doesn't reach to a wall that it needs to adjoin to, we extend it as if it joined. And when we have a sukkah and part of the roofing is invalid, it doesn't work, there's something wrong with it. It's too thick, it doesn't let in enough light because it has to have a little bit of light through, or it's permanent, or it's still attached to a tree. As long as it's within 4 cubits of the wall, the sukkah will still be kosher, and the principle is that we look at the walls as if they curved inward up to the point where the invalid transitions to the valid roofing. And these laws, which you don't need to explain more than that for today, these laws were transmitted to Moses at Sinai, according to Rabbi Meir. So as we see, it's not just important to the sages to figure out what the standards are, what area of the law we're applying these standards in, what the origin of these standards were, and who said it before, right? Which sage in the previous generation held which way, so that we can, have some, reason to base it this way. Over time, now it's much easier for us. They were working it out during the generations of the Mishna and the Gemara. In the many generations since the Gemara was set down, these laws have become much more standardized, and we have a very good sense of what the minimum and maximum volumes and heights are for these things. And now we're going to finish up, and I'm going to get to your comments and questions in one moment. So if you haven't asked, put in the comments now. But we go back to where we opened this discussion with the crossbeam at the end of the alley. And we said that it has to be no more than 20 cubits above the ground in order to render that alley as a private place where the people who live in the courtyards that empty into it can carry, say, visit one courtyard to another, take a loaf of bread to the neighbor on Shabbos. Well, what if the alley is constructed in such a way that we can't lower the crossbeam? For whatever reason, we can't lower the crossbeam. So there's an adjustment. There's a fix for that, right? It has to be no more than 20 cubits above the ground. If we can't lower the beam, we can raise the ground. We can raise the ground. Now, the part that we raise of the ground, how wide does it have to be? In this, the law follows Rav Yosef, who said just 1 handbreadth wide. In other words, enough to be conspicuous so that people will notice it. It's like a curb that they have to step over when they enter that alley. And something on the ground is easily noticed, so we just need the 1 handbreadth. However, that is a minimum, and because people walk on it, one must take care that that elevated ground doesn't get worn down and it no longer is 1 handbreadth wide. So people are going to have to continually monitor that. And as we saw yesterday, since all of the people who live around that alley are going to be responsible for it, they need to organize themselves to make sure it gets taken care of, the beam and this elevated ground, if they go that route. Because it could easily happen that people say, well, somebody else will take care of it, and then nobody takes care of it. John Shore mentioned yesterday that's called the tragedy of the commons. But I love Bill Eldridge's point yesterday. He said, well, actually, it's not so bad when a bunch of people are responsible for something. Things can get done better than if only one person is responsible, as long as they get organized and make sure they take care of business. It's the situation where no one takes that leadership role, where everyone just passes the buck, that we have that, as the Talmud put it, a pot owned by partners is neither hot nor cold. No one is taking care of business. Okay, that's what I have for us today. Let's look at some questions. All right, let me grab that, and I'm going to put it right over here. Okay, so Pedro Fotografo says, is it known or recorded in the Talmud of people getting flogged for breaking the vow of Nazirus? So someone vowed that they would not drink or benefit from wine for a certain amount of time. And then they did it. They broke their vow. So then they're subject to lashes. Now, I think in this situation, this is also punishment imposed by the court. So just like capital punishment, I have to double check this, but I'm 99% sure that for a court to impose a punishment of this kind, lashes, it's going to be the same rule as for imposing capital punishment. And that is that there have to be 2 witnesses, and the witnesses have to say to the person, if you drink that, you are going to be subject to lashes, and then the person does it within the amount of time that it takes to greet a friend after he was given the warning. That was witnessed by 2 witnesses, and then he took the minimum measure, which is what we were talking about here, that quarter lug of wine. So if all those conditions are present, then he could get flogged. But that's a lot of conditions. It's so much so that I would say rare event indeed. Sharon Fran Brooks, I am a deadhead. I got to get that shirt. Way to go, Sharon. You and I speak the same language. Kathleen Ann, Shalom. Your presentations are very enlightening. I never had a clue how backward I seem. You are not backward. All of us are, carry this tremendous potential for learning. And the less we know, the greater our potential. And that's what's so great when we bump into a situation when we can start learning. Let's see. Patrice Carter says, thank you for the presentation. I have to learn a lot. I wasn't raised Jewish, just born Jewish. So, look, how many of us, and myself included, were exposed to the tradition kind of accidentally. And that's not so accidental. We learn a lot from our parents. There's a lot to being Jewish, even if we didn't have a proper Jewish education. But how much more we can learn and how much richer that inheritance can be once we start learning. Okay, thank you, Brian. Let me hand that back. There were just the 3, right? Okay, and let me just see if there was anything else. Okay, Okay, Nina's mentioning to me that Todd Sukol said, thanks for sharing about my zuzah. He's at miZuzah. So here's the zuzah. Let me give that another plug. We partnered with myzuzah.org. If you're a Jew and you don't have a mezuzah on your house, you're giving up a lot of protection. Having a mezuzah on the house is a very holy thing to do, a very spiritual thing to do, and a very protective thing to do for your house. And myzuzah.org, myzuzah.org, will send you a kosher mezuzah worth $80 for free if you go to their website. Nina's putting the link in the comments. It's myzuzah.org. Use promotion code accidental, and you get this $80 thing for free. I'll just mention, if you already have a mezuzah, that's not real. It's to get Jews who are devoid of mezuzah in their life to have one. That's the purpose of the organization. And if you're not Jewish, it's really not for you, because a non-Jew is not obligated to have a mezuzah on their home. So if they put one up, it doesn't provide that kind of protection. It's just an adornment, and a misleading adornment. But if you're Jewish and you don't have a mezuzah, then this is for you. Okay, and Lynn said, it reminds me of the prophet sent to Jeroboam in the northern kingdom. He was told not to eat anything at all while in that territory. I guess the whole territory had a curse like tsaras on the walls. I'm not familiar with the incident. I can't really comment enough. But there is this idea that you might be going to a place that is so corrupt that it's not about, tsaras doesn't afflict non-Jews, right? So this is one of those cases where, the afflictions of love, right? Like sages are so much wiser and holier even than the average Jew. And so when they make a tiny transgression, they can actually suffer for it quite a bit, where the average Jew would not be punished by God. And likewise, Jews are held to this standard in terms of Torah obligations that non-Jews are not. So I really lost my train of thought there. But the point is, that tsaras is like, it's something that we suffer that other people don't suffer. Tsaras does not get visited on non-Jews. So nobody gets it now. But even in ancient times, it was only Jews who would get those skin afflictions, or the walls of their house would suffer those afflictions. And Ed Berg says, of course you're addressing dreadlocks while wearing the Grateful Yid shirt. That's a total coincidence. Sarah McKay says, what is said of the purification of a convert who has tattoos? What a great question. So the Torah says, tattoos are not permitted to a Jew, but they are permitted to a non-Jew. So if you get tattoos when you're a non-Jew, well, you didn't violate any law. And then you become a Jew. What about your tattoos? I think nothing. It doesn't matter. Now you're a Jew, so you shouldn't get more tattoos. But in the, like in ancient times, they didn't have tattoo removal. So that was just not a possibility. And people with tattoos would convert, and then they would be Jews like everybody else. And by the way, sometimes people have heard that if you have tattoos, if a Jew has a tattoo, he can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery. That is a myth. It is false. That is 100% false. He shouldn't get a tattoo, but if he got a tattoo, of course he can still be buried in a Jewish cemetery. Final question of the day, Lucy Rom Johnson. I like those somewhat fluid measurements connected to living things, and they're used in those laws, leaving room for accommodations and a bit of flexibility and openness to change. The law should not be cold and mechanical because it is meant to help and guide and thus live. It is not meant to be aversive and punishing. That's exactly right. And the teaching that we have, the classic teaching on that is this is a Torah of life. These are laws to live by, not to die by. These laws elevate us. Sometimes, we just get into that frame of mind that, if I wasn't subject to all these laws, I could just eat in that awesome new restaurant that opened, but what can I do? I can't eat there, and I can't go in my car on Shabbos. I can't play golf on Shabbos. I can't do this. I can't do that. But the fact that we are held to all these laws, if we buy into them and live that life, in the end, they elevate us. And when we face difficult situations, I'm not a rabbi. It's not for me to answer that question. It's not for you to answer that question. When we reach a tough question, we need to consult with a rabbi, not just to get a ruling, but to have a conversation with an authorized spiritual leader. Right? Those conversations, when we get a clarification on a law and how it applies to our lives, it's generally not just you can do it, you can't do it. It leads to a conversation, and something beautiful almost always comes out of such a conversation. Was there something else? Okay, this is the last question. So Pedro Fotografo says, what would you say is the equivalent of tzara'as today? Well, there's not an equivalent to tzara'as, right? There's not an equivalent to tzara'as. However, I would say that there is natural consequences to engaging in prohibited speech. Right? When we gossip about people, when we engage in humiliating others, when we tell lies about people, when we even say good things about people, but we make them the subject of our conversation instead of just being present with the people we're around, over time, that causes great damage. Studying the laws of Lashon Hara is just about one of the most productive things that anyone can do. The tongue of a human is so powerful. Guarding our speech, refining our speech, elevating our speech is 100% transformative. May we all be blessed to elevate ourselves through our study and practice of these teachings. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow. It's Friday, so it'll be the early show, noon Pacific